You don't typically see Finland making the news when it comes to helping Ukraine. The country has had its own share of problems with Russia, which is understandable when you realize that Finland has the second longest European border with Russia, the first being Ukraine itself. But it seems Finland has finally decided to get its hands dirty by helping Ukraine to end the war directly. How? Let's dig into it. First, you need to understand why the conflict between Ukraine and Russia has lasted so long. The war in Ukraine is considered one of the deadliest conflicts of the 21st century compared to its relatively short duration thus far. This could be attributed to both sides of the conflict using a mixture of old and new technologies. While Russia initially had the tech lead through its more numerous and advanced military, Ukraine has done wonders to catch up, and in some cases overtake it thanks to NATO donations. However, throughout the war, there has been a somewhat odd consistency to what weapons Ukraine received from its Western allies. Sure, NATO has pledged at least $300 billion in aid, according to the most recent statistics from the Kiel Institute for the World Economy. Some sources suggest that the figure has already surpassed $380 billion and is closer to $400 billion instead. This figure includes both bilateral and unilateral aid from the governments of various NATO member states, and encompasses direct military aid in the form of weapons, vehicles, and technology. But what most countries have done to provide that aid is to skim their supplies of soon-to-be obsolete equipment and donate this excess stock to Ukraine. In other words, these supplies were about to get dropped out of use by their respective militaries anyway. Take the base version of the M1 Abrams, which was designed in the 1980s. The tanks donated to Ukraine are more modernized M1A1 and M1A2 tanks that are somewhat comparable to the best versions that the US keeps exclusively for its own armed forces. This was achieved by pulling old tanks out of storage, of which there are roughly 3,500, and retrofitting them with new parts. The result, a Frankenstein-ish M1A1 Abrams made specifically for export to Ukraine. Of course, there's a method to the madness. Donating fresh tanks would require them to be ordered and built from scratch, and the US Army is unlikely to give up its active units. The same principle applies to the airplanes Ukraine has received over the past year. President Zelensky was adamant that the country needed more than 100 F-16 fighter jets to be able to defend itself against the numerically superior Russian air forces. And in early January, several European NATO countries pulled their F-16s and sent them to Ukraine. These were only donated because they were being replaced by F-35s in the donor countries. The F-16 isn't that modern anymore, as the planes given to Ukraine needed several modifications to be able to accommodate new surveillance systems and weapons that NATO has provided. Which brings us back to how the Nordic countries are going to do things differently. Over the summer of 2024, Finland announced that it would be switching gears. The most recent round of military aid from Finland to Ukraine, the 25th time Finland has sent weapons or equipment to Ukraine, would include advanced weapons prototypes instead of existing designs. The news came directly from the Finnish Defence Force Arms Chief Mikko Heiskanen. According to Heiskanen, Finland will send top-secret classified projects to Ukraine for real-world testing. The Finnish Defence Force claims that the experience gained on the battlefields in Ukraine will help shape the latest Finnish equipment. In turn, this should increase demand for these weapons from other countries, boosting Finland's prospects of becoming a notable arms and equipment supplier to NATO and beyond. Of course, due to the projects being classified, we're in the dark as to what's being sent to the Ukrainian military or how much of it. The wording of Heiskanen's report mentions that the latest batch of donations will serve the interests of both Ukraine's and Finland's military. What does this mean exactly? Well, for one, it's highly likely that Finland has already exhausted its stockpile of spare or obsolete equipment that it could comfortably send to Ukraine. This might not be such a bad thing, though. It implies that the Finnish military mostly uses newer weapons and believes that these will be enough to face any potential Russian aggression. The second reason why Finland is likely not sending its own stock of weapons is familiarity, or more precisely, Ukraine's lack of it. The Ukrainian research network New Geopolitics has implied that Ukraine would gladly take any piece of Soviet-era weaponry and systems it could get, but had to be more selective with NATO equivalents. With Ukraine having had its military structured and equipment based on old Soviet designs, its soldiers were trained to use them. The same is not true for contemporary Western systems, at least not yet. A donation of Western-designed weapons only means that the Ukrainian army would have to take the time to retrain its troops to use them. This would cost them too much time and initiative in the war, especially while they are fully engaged trying to repel a major Russian onslaught. Thirdly, we need to go back to the first part of the report from the Finnish defense chief. Finland is sending neither old equipment nor existing gear. It's sending prototypes of future weapons. The war in Ukraine is one of the few opportunities Western countries have to witness how their weapons fare on a relatively even playing field. For example, the war on terror involved many NATO countries sending their troops and equipment to the Middle East. However, they had a significant military technology advantage over Iraq and Afghanistan, where the Taliban and the insurgents mainly used unmodified Soviet-era systems. The US could exercise almost complete air dominance over these countries, especially in Afghanistan, which had practically no air defenses in place. In Ukraine, the situation is very different. Russia is considered to have some of the most advanced military systems in the world, especially in terms of anti-air defenses and long-range artillery. Russian self-propelled artillery vehicles can fire at nearly twice the rate of contemporary Western designs. Even if they're not as effective in terms of accuracy or pure firepower, Russia can compensate for that with sheer numbers. By some estimates, Russia is able to manufacture over 3 million artillery rounds per year. On the other hand, the entirety of NATO could only cobble together just over 1 million shells to send to Ukraine in a year by relying solely on new production and procurement from various countries in the global south. Sending more would mean that the West would have to dip into its existing stocks, which could take years to be replenished. The comparable technological levels between Russia and Ukraine, at least in some areas, are exactly why the battlefields in Ukraine are so useful for Western analysts. Watching how the theory compares to reality is critical in showcasing the Western weapons that excel in modern warfare. But even more importantly, it can shine a spotlight on technology or equipment that is less useful than its cost and investment imply. A good example of this is the prevalence of drone warfare. Both Russia and Ukraine have developed several parallel systems that use small commercial drones designed for video making or agriculture as the base for military drones. Drones that were initially intended for pro-photography have been pivotal in giving military officers an eye in the sky that costs less than $1,000 per piece, a price so low that it's practically inconceivable in the US military industry. Agricultural drones were repurposed by Ukraine into the so-called Vampire or Baba Yaga drone. Instead of fertilizing equipment, these drones now carry mortar shells and mines, which they drop directly onto enemy infantry or fortifications. The drones add yet another dimension to modern war strategies, one where real-time monitoring and response are practically a given. This has resulted in towed artillery systems like the howitzers hailing from the Soviet era, which both sides of the war are using, only being useful in significant numbers. The howitzers need to be deployed, fire, and then be disassembled before moving. This process takes time, during which they are practically sitting ducks if the enemy can use a few drones to determine their positions. And with more modernized drones equipped with the capacity for excellent night vision and infrared detection, there aren't many places for stationary weapons to hide. To remain relevant in the warfare of the future, there are two possible avenues of progress for these weapons. They'll either need advanced camouflage or hit-and-run functionality. The Swedes seem to have taken charge of the former, with advanced Barracuda camo systems being pioneered in Ukraine. The HIMARS systems have proven to be an excellent example of the latter. The self-propelled anti-air missile launcher can start relocating within minutes of firing a salvo. Considering the average HIMARS armament spends only a minute and a half in the air, Russia doesn't have enough time to both respond to the missile and track down the truck that fired it. So with all these improvements in mind, what's Finland's contribution to the cause? As mentioned, the official news outlet and the defense ministry are tight-lipped. Considering that the projects are supposedly still in the prototype phase, it's likely that we'll need to wait years for more announcements, likely to only come after the war in Ukraine ends one way or another. But we can fish for some clues in the meantime. Finland's largest weapons manufacturer, at least domestically, is Patria. It's a defense contractor majority owned by the Finnish government, with the other 49.9% owned by the Norwegian defense group Kongsberg Defence and Aerospace AS. Patria has been responsible for delivering several contemporary systems to the national defense sectors in Finland and abroad. Some of these systems have even been seen on the Ukrainian battlefields. The first example is the Patria AMV, or Armored Modular Vehicle, an 8x8 multi-role vehicle. The key advancement in Patria's designs lies in its ability to incorporate various weapon systems and technologies. Depending on the configuration, the AMV can serve as an armored personnel carrier, infantry support vehicle, or medical support vehicle. To this end, there are a few variations of the specific chassis that the AMV can use. High roof models are used for command and transport, while heavy armament models are used for attaching weapon systems. The AMV also has a more robust armor plating system, designed to withstand most common anti-tank mines, such as the ubiquitous TM62s that both Ukraine and Russia have used throughout the war. Patria has exported its AMV designs to Poland, modifying them to reduce the armor but add on amphibious operation capabilities. One of the possible avenues of improvement for this AMV system comes from the aforementioned failures of towed artillery. In particular, Patria also makes a 155mm towed gun howitzer, with a high fire rate of 6 rounds per minute and an ability to self-propel short distances via an integrated diesel engine and a wheeled platform. Patria has previously experimented with mounting the howitzer onto a Soviet T-55 tank chassis. However, the resulting weapon experienced difficulties with reduced accuracy after being redeployed and the barrel's erratic behavior during longer-range shots. While Finland hasn't sent any of the Patriot-made 155mm gun howitzers to Ukraine, at least according to official reports, Finland has sent some of its stock of towed gun artillery. These include the Soviet 2A36 Gyastint B 152mm and M46 130mm howitzers. With both being Soviet designs, Ukraine could readily make good use of them due to its domestic artillery manufacturing capabilities. This was likely Finland's way of clearing out obsolete stock. This would imply that the country also has sent its remaining supply of ammunition for these weapons, as its newer 150mm guns can consistently use ammo made for pretty much any other NATO-based design. Additionally, the Finnish news agency Yle reported in 2023 that Patriot was considering creating new AMVs in Ukraine, using Ukraine's domestic manufacturing resources under license from Patriot. This implied that the AMVs have performed favorably in Ukraine so far, likely due to their modular designs and opportunity for future modifications. The latter has been one of the key ways that Ukraine has stayed ahead of Russia during the war. Therefore, it's possible that Finland is looking into the possibility of using Patriot AMV chassis as the base for domestic self-propelled gun howitzers based on the Patriot artillery. The result will likely be heavily inspired by the French truck-mounted gun howitzer Caesar. The Caesar also uses a 155mm howitzer as the armament, but the entire system uses a 6x6 truck as the base. Patriot's alterations could include the AMV's robust armor plating system or the added reliability and carrying capacity of the 8x8 chassis. This advancement is supported by the fact that the Caesars have outperformed both the US-made tracked M109A6 Paladin and the British-towed M777, which both use the 155mm cannons. While roughly a third of the tracked artillery donated to Ukraine has been lost to the Russian offensive, only a tenth of the donated Caesars have been destroyed so far. This implies that the added mobility from putting the gun on a wheeled chassis drastically improves its survivability, emphasizing the need for hit-and-run tactics for mid- to long-range systems. The second vehicle that Patriot has donated to Ukraine is the Pacey Armored Personnel Carrier. Unlike the AMV, the Pacey is a six-wheeled, lightly armored, fully amphibious vehicle. In a 2023 report, at least 20 Pacey models were sent to Ukraine by the end of that year. Similarly to the AMV, the Pacey XA180 and the XA185 don't have native armament systems. However, the vehicle has a rotating turret base, which accepts an autocannon or a machine gun to transform it into an infantry support vehicle. However, there are not many reports about the vehicle's performance in Ukraine. Patriot's upgrades to the Pacey seem to end with the XA200 series, which was designed with heavier armor. This caused the vehicle to lose its fully amphibious operational capacity, only allowing it to wade into 5-foot deep water instead. The XA202 is primarily used as a communications and command vehicle and is currently fielded by both the Finnish and Swedish armed forces. A report in February 2022 indicates that Patriot was in the process of upgrading the Swedish vehicles to improve their intended lifespan for another couple of decades. The upgrades were supposed to take place until 2025. Patriot might use the real-life experience of the XA185's performance in Ukraine to course-correct the improvements to the existing XA202s. Finally, Patriot has recently announced an upgraded mobile 120mm mortar system named Tremos. The design of the Tremos uses traditional heavy mortar armaments integrated into a modular carriage system, similar to what the AMVs might use, and then mounted on a military truck. The Tremos system is supposedly compatible with 4x4, 6x6, 8x8, and even tracked vehicles due to its improved recoil reduction capability, which should improve the truck's stability and curb some wear and tear. One of the hallmarks of the Tremos is its hit-and-run capability, allowing the vehicle to open fire after only a minute of setup and leave immediately after the last mortar is fired. It could potentially have been inspired by improvements to existing systems and is, in a sense, an acknowledgement that this type of technology has proved most useful in the war in Ukraine. But why does a future vehicle matter if Ukraine's problem is in the present? Well, Tremos is supposed to enter production in early 2025. Considering that it's become highly unlikely that the war will end anytime soon, Finland might start actively producing the system for the sole purpose of immediately sending it to Ukraine. This might not be pure conjecture either. Consider the previously mentioned report from June 2024, where the Finnish Defense Ministry suggested that it's already sending prototypes to Ukraine. These might include precursors or prototypes of the Tremos. Tremos might also get its first field tests in Ukraine, allowing Patriot to gain valuable experience of the system's functionality and success rates. Remember, Russia has some of the most robust defensive systems in the world and is Finland's direct neighbor. In a hypothetical scenario where Russia attacks any NATO country, Finland would have no choice but to join the conflict. Furthermore, Heiskanen mentioned that some production capacity reserved for domestic arms manufacturing could be used to create more weapons for Ukraine. Heiskanen urged that this would require political will and funding from the Finnish government, the majority owner of the Patriot Defence Group. Thus, the process goes full circle, and the Finnish government controls both the arms manufacturer and the means to send more weapons to Ukraine. And considering that Finland's relations with Russia have taken a sharp downturn in recent years, its government might just be emboldened enough to make more aggressive and public movements. Immediately after the war in Ukraine started in February 2022, Russia seemed to try to undermine the Finnish government and economy. In a BBC report from November 2023, Finnish officials claimed that Russia was trying to overwhelm the Finno-Russian border by sending illegal migrants from Syria, Iraq, and Yemen all the way from the south of Russia to Scandinavia. In response, Finland closed most of its border crossings with Russia in 2024 and enacted a law to block asylum seekers coming from Russia. The law, which runs contrary to Finland's previous commitments to international human rights efforts, is one of the more public ways in which Finland has responded to what it perceives as Russia's efforts to undermine it. In late 2023, Russia had already passed the torch of breaking down relations by refusing to renew a border agreement with Finland that had been in place since 2012. The hybrid warfare tactic that Russia is employing inside Finland is effectively a direct response to Finland joining NATO in 2023, which itself is a response to Russia annexing Crimea in 2014 and then fully invading Ukraine in 2022. As such, it's understandable that Finland, with its own history of war against Russia in the 20th century, would be wary of its aggressive neighbor. Now, Finland might have the opportunity to step up its support for Ukraine further. With the August 2024 invasion of the Russian region of Kursk, Ukraine has again stepped over one of Russia's so-called nuclear red lines without a response. Remember the F-16s we talked about at the start of the video? They were partially delayed because Putin had threatened that their deployment in Ukraine might be just cause for Russia to use nukes against NATO members supplying them. When that didn't happen, Russia threatened that the supply of weapons enabling Ukraine to strike into Russia would be considered the same way. Then the Kursk incursion came and Russia's response took a while to gather steam. Ukraine has already managed to strike Moscow in large-scale drone attacks, albeit causing minimal damage. Finland and Sweden have already started sending some of their more modern equipment to Ukraine. If Finland decides that it's actually time for Russia to get out of Ukraine, the steps are clear. Mobilize domestic arms production to deliver more modern weapons to the Ukrainian army. Will this happen? The current prototype testing going on in Ukraine indicates it just might. After that, it's up to Finland and NATO to keep finding ways to try and push Russia into submission. But what do you think? How far is Finland willing to go against Russia? And what other weapons might the Finns send to Ukraine? Let us know in the comments below, and thank you for watching. Now go and check out Belarus has had enough of Russia. Get out, or click this other video instead.